unless there's any other like local announcements, I'll hand over to Shane Timmons, who's a senior research officer in the ESRI's Behavioural Research Unit. And Shane sent me a wee biographical note, which is I think I'll read it in full because it's quite interesting. Different sets of skills that are not what you'd usually associate with catering for cycling, making and creating cycle lanes. But actually, when you think about it, I think when we see the presentation tonight, you realize that they're really important. So Shane's a senior research officer in ESRI. His research uses insights from psychology and behavioral economics to design experiments to inform policy in multiple areas. Shane has worked on projects commissioned by a wide range of state bodies, including the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Transport Authority, and the National Disability Authority. Recent work has focused on environmental policy problems and includes laboratory experiments, online experiments, and field trials on the intention-action gap for climate mitigation, public perceptions of environmental hazards, and cognitive biases that lead to climate policy opposition. Prior to joining the Behaviour Research Unit, Shane completed a PhD in cognitive psychology with the Reasoning and Imagination Lab in Trinity College Dublin, which I wasn't aware of until I saw your note there, Shane. And a Reasoning and Imagination Lab sounds like a fantastic thing to be involved with. So I'm going to hand over to you now, and you're going to share your slides. But I think just to note that the paper that you issued recently, and that got good media coverage, was funded by, I think, the Fingal City Council and the National Transport Authority.
Yeah.
So thanks very much, Shane. Hand over to you.
Thanks, Will, and thanks for the invitation. Yeah, very happy to be presenting on our work here. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen while talking. Multitasking is not my forte, but everyone can see that okay? Yeah, very good. So yeah, thanks a million for the invite. I'm going to today talk about some work. It's joint work with Ilva Anderson, Phelan McGowan, and Pete Lunn, all some current members of the Behavioural Research Unit at the ESRI. Phelan is now in the University of Galway. But I'm going to talk about some findings from a paper that we published, was made publicly available just last week. And yeah, as Will said, so the paper itself is jointly funded by Fingal County Council and the National Transport Authority. The funding actually came in independently, so we were approached kind of separately at the same time to look at issues related to active travel and whether we could take a kind of psychological behavioral science approach to some issues. So the aims for us at the outset were to look at what has been done in the academic literature in this space. Obviously a kind of very, very broad area, and as Will pointed to, when you think about cycle lanes and active travel infrastructure being implemented, it's not always a psychologist that you think of. It's usually maybe an urban planner, an engineer, an architect, and so on. But we wanted to have a look at the existing international literature to see what kind of behavioral perspective had been taken on it. So the paper itself is now published in widely international reviews, Climate Change. So that's publicly available, open access. We also have a working paper on the website, which kind of has a bit more detail in it. We had to cut some of the details out for journal word counts and that kind of thing, but it's all publicly available. The aims of the report, as I said, was to kind of take a broad behavioral science perspective to the issue of implementing active travel infrastructure. Some of the questions that we sought to answer in it was, firstly, well, does infrastructure matter for behavior change? We also wanted to see then whether there are design decisions that could be made about active travel infrastructure to help them be more successful. So in essence, to help encourage behavior change. And then a related issue that we wanted to address in it was whether there was anything done to investigate what matters for public support of infrastructure change. The kind of motivation for this came from what might be perceived as kind of contradictory but anecdotal evidence. So on the non-anecdotal side, we have lots of kind of survey research now showing that the public are very concerned about climate change, for example, but then lots of media coverage of examples of oppositions to infrastructure being changed. So we wanted to see whether anyone internationally had looked at that issue. So I'm going to try to summarize some of this evidence tonight. I haven't included references on my slides because there's just too many of them. They're going to all be in the paper, but I'm going to try to highlight some of the main findings. So firstly, just to get straight into what are the effects of changing infrastructure to try to facilitate active travel. So we did initially set out thinking of active travel quite broadly, so including walking, cycling, and so on. But the international evidence does focus primarily on cycling, so that's where most of our evidence is going to focus on as well, primarily on cycling. So firstly, does changing infrastructure change behavior? So the kind of overwhelming evidence here suggests that it's a yes. So it's not guaranteed. It does depend on how the infrastructure is designed and implemented. But the most robust evaluations of infrastructure change suggest that yes, it will change. It does lead to more active travel. So what I mean there by the most robust trials, I have an example of one here, is where the evaluations are done in a kind of experimentally controlled manner, as experimentally controlled as you can get when it comes to infrastructure change. So usually when we want to evaluate something, we'll run a randomized control trial. Some people are familiar with them with kind of vaccine trials and so on, where you have a control group and an experimental group. With infrastructure, that's more difficult. In this case, what you do is you take two areas in a city or maybe two separate towns that have very similar profiles, monitor the active travel behavior before the change is put in place, and then monitor it again afterwards. So by looking at the sort of relative change in behavior over time, you can then attribute it to the change in infrastructure. So from those robust trials, the evidence suggests that maybe about a 30% increase in rates of active travel internationally. So very few of this evidence comes from Ireland. Most of it is coming from, a lot of it is done in the UK, some in Denmark, some in New Zealand, some in the US, some in South America. So that's kind of where the evidence is coming from. Importantly with this though, there is variation in how successful changing the infrastructure is. So environmental factors matter. One of the kind of primary environmental factors, not too surprising, is proximity. So the closer you live to the infrastructure change, the more likely you are to use it. And there's some studies suggesting there's nearly kind of a dose response. So the more access you have to different types of infrastructure, maybe different lanes, different cycle lanes, the more likely you are to use it. Some things here, again, I probably should have caveated from the outset that some of these findings are not going to be terribly surprising to people on the call, but I'm just pointing out here where we have kind of good evidence for or where evidence gaps are missing. So steep inclines can hinder effectiveness, although there is some suggestion now that e-bikes might be dampening this effect, but that's very, very recent evidence. And one thing that's potentially interesting and relevant for the Irish climate, so actual weather effects tend to actually be quite small in temperate climates, so where you have climates like we have in Ireland, so similar in the UK and the Netherlands and Denmark and so on. So weather seems to be less of a hindrance than people might expect. But importantly here, we don't have information on people's beliefs about weather. So kind of people might be put off engaging with active travel infrastructure because they might believe that it's going to rain more than it actually does, for example. So we don't have any evidence from that sort of from that respect. Okay, so we can kind of conclude here that changing infrastructure is likely to lead to behavior change and increased rates of active travel, but there are also knock-on effects. So the knock-on effects that we summarize, they're mostly in the working paper rather than the published version, because the journal just wanted us to focus on the kind of more behavioral side. But just to try to go quickly through these. So knock-on effects on health and environment, again, this won't be terribly surprising to people on the call. So we've declines in mobility related CO2 emissions, so less emissions coming from cars, other greenhouse gases, and improvements in air quality. So just to give an example there, so one evaluation that was done in Scotland that was quite robustly measured, active travel infrastructure in 6 locations saved an estimated 5,000 tons of CO2 per year. And then to put that in perspective, I think the average car is 2.75 tons per year. So lots of savings there from the active travel infrastructure, and some kind of what might seem to be obvious health effects. So if you are reducing air pollution, reducing noise pollution, and have people kind of engaging in more active forms of transport, you will see reductions in BMI, blood pressure, diabetes, reduced childhood obesity, mortality rates, birth complications, and so on. So lots of very positive benefits coming out in the available international evidence. Traffic congestion is where it might get a bit more interesting. So this is one of the kind of topics that the literature suggests is a bit more controversial. So people might oppose active travel infrastructure being implemented because they think it's going to make traffic worse. So I'll give you some case studies here, some examples that are done. So one study in Toronto estimated a 14 to 30% increase in traffic after a lane was removed to facilitate cycling. And then some modeling studies done in Australia estimated a 7% increase in traffic in car travel times, with increases in active travel infrastructure. Now, these are the kinds of findings that you can imagine might make headlines or might be used, but it's one thing that we found quite interesting while doing this review is to try to put these increases in context. So if we translate those percentages into what actually happens to a motorist's journey, so if I'm driving and now a cycle lane has been implemented and there's a 7% increase in my travel time, what does that mean for me? Well, on average, it's a minute or two longer on my journey. So really anywhere that they're modeling it kind of projects there to be increases in car travel times, they tend to be very, very small. Probably imperceptibly small on kind of the grand scale of your journey. Not to say that people won't be frustrated by it or if they expect these changes to occur. So psychologically it might be different, but on average the data suggests that it's about 1 or 2 minutes longer. Very important caveat with this, though, is that any of these modeling studies on anticipated increases in car travel times, they tend to do so assuming no substitution from car journeys. So they assume essentially that there is no behavior change, that everyone's driving as much as they were before, and therefore we're getting these increases. So that's an important caveat when kind of considering these studies. Obviously, if the infrastructure is successful at bringing about these behavior changes, you should see that substitution from car traffic, which would lead to reductions, and there's evidence for that being the case as well. On to other knock-on effects. So this is another issue that tends to crop up internationally in terms of opposition towards active travel schemes, and that's effect on the economy. So part of what seems to drive this is that retailers tend to overestimate the proportion of their customers who travel by car. But one paper that was quite useful in our review is a review in itself. So this is a systematic review of the economic impact of active travel infrastructure, looking at the effects on local retail businesses. So what this review showed or suggested that improving active travel facilities generally has either a positive effect or a null effect on local retail and food services nearby. So essentially what that means is either there's no change in the revenue or it increases in general. The per month spend among non-motorists, they find across, and the systematic review looks at multiple different types of studies. So we treat that as stronger evidence than it coming from one individual study, that the per month spend among people who are not in cars is actually higher in local retail and hospitality than motorists. And what seems to be driving this is that motorists will make less frequent journeys and have a higher per journey spend. But on average, people who travel by bike or people who walk tend to make more frequent journeys, and therefore over the space of the month, their spend increases or tends to be higher. Importantly here, the assessment doesn't seem to depend on whether parking is removed or a cycle lane is implemented. So if a traffic lane is removed, so it's not sensitive to what the change is. An important caveat with this, though, is that the positive effects seem to apply to retail and food and not to every business, the exceptions being the ones that focus on motorists. So a petrol station is not going to do better when an active travel lane is implemented and there are fewer people driving. That seems to kind of make logical sense. But essentially here, there's no evidence from any robust trial that was in this of a negative relationship between improving active travel facilities and local retail sales. Sorry, I'm taking a bit longer to get through this than I expected, so I'm going to try to speed up a bit. We also then looked at, okay, if active travel infrastructure is implemented and we want all of these positive benefits, there needs to be that behavior change element. And so we looked at, okay, from the behavior change perspective, what matters? So in terms of the psychological predictors of use, the one that kind of came out most strongly were perceptions of safety. So how safe do people think they're going to feel when they're cycling is likely to improve or to increase their likelihood then of actually cycling. The things that matter here, again, probably on this call, I don't need to inform you about them, but the ones that come up in the evidence is that wide lanes that are segregated from other traffic, including pedestrians, that are not combined with bus lanes, that have physical boundaries and are differentiated by color. They're what seem to matter. There's a few interesting studies on the color aspect, looking at using kind of a CCTV footage of what happens to motorists when a lane is painted in color rather than just the white line kind of going across, and that they actually stay further away from the lane and are less likely to park in the lane when it's colored versus not. And the study kind of looked at the exact same area and just the change once it was painted. Importantly here as well, there can be large effects of removing any one of these features. So for example, if you implement the colored lane with the physical boundaries, but make it a narrow one instead of a wide one, you see a steep drop then in perceptions of safety. And so it's the kind of combination of features that matters. Associations looking at actual safety, so not how people feel, but actually the, say, collision data and so on. That was difficult to get at in the literature, mostly because of poor data availability. So if people are not reporting collisions, or near misses and so on, then it's difficult to evaluate what matters from those. But what appears to be important in the literature, at least, is to reduce actual collisions, having one-way lanes, and in particular changes at intersections. So advanced stop lines, dedicated priority lights, raised cyclist crossings are given priority to cyclists there, and traffic calming measures like reduced speed limits. All of those kinds of things matter for actual safety from the available data that's there. In terms of, so other psychological predictors of change, one of the big ones that came out were is also on connectivity. So the literature calls it removing the discontinuities in lanes. But essentially what it means is that if you are able to cycle your full journey on dedicated infrastructure, that is associated with a much stronger increase than in active travel rates. Some examples here from my images where I found these quite entertaining. I just got them off The Guardian. There are probably some from around here as well. But essentially by discontinuities, it means that the lane doesn't end like this, that you can go from point A, so maybe near to where you live, to where you're doing your shopping, where the kids are going to school, where you work, and so on. Importantly, their intersections need to feel safe. So if you have the dedicated infrastructure going from point A to point B, any intersections there, people need to feel safe when they're making those crossings, if they're going to actually get on the bike for them. And then also what emerged from the literature was that having secure bike parking facilities boosts rates of active travel, and it appears that that is especially important for women and older adults, so people who might be less likely to cycle. That leads me on to the next point. So a point about who benefits from active travel infrastructure once it's implemented. What I can say about this literature is that it's actually it's a bit inconclusive, so it's not entirely clear who benefits. So there are some studies showing that those who cycle already simply do so more when the active travel is infrastructure. But other studies show that those who are least likely to cycle show the largest amount of behavior change. So there's conflict there with it. Some considerations to take into account. Firstly is that the so-called gender gap in cycling appears to only exist in low cycling societies. So for example, the estimate that is given on it is that once you hit a 7% of the population cycling, there's no gender gap. So once you kind of have that level of cycling, there's no difference between the number of men and women who are cycling. But before that, it seems to be heavily biased towards men. Some of the evidence suggests that perceptions of safety may be particularly important in closing that gap. But a caveat with the literature here is that gendered processes are rarely considered. So for example, the different types of journeys that men and women make are rarely considered in the literature. But in general, the evidence seems to point towards when infrastructure is implemented in a way that takes into account those factors that I talked about as mattering for behavior change, the gender gap narrows. And the same is true for the age gap. Now, the age gap does appear in all jurisdictions, so older people being less likely to cycle. But again, it seems that older adults may be more sensitive to the kinds of features that I mentioned as being important for behavior change. So having that full A to B connectivity. And then the evidence for younger people and children, heavy traffic, high speed limits, tricky intersections are all deterrents. Again, not too surprising. But what's important with some of this evidence is that a lot of it comes from within city studies. So it's not just the kind of cultural differences, but where you make these changes within a city, you will see more of the older people in that city making use of that infrastructure. So that can't then be attributed to cultural differences between countries. And then the last section for me is on public support. Unfortunately, this section will be a bit quicker. So what influences support for infrastructure change? Again, you'll probably be quite familiar with the sorts of headlines that we see when infrastructure changes tends to be proposed. When we had a look at this evidence, there's actually very little direct evidence for reasons why. So there's some interviews done with people kind of before and after, but that's really the extent of it. There were no sort of wide-scale systematic studies that were done looking at what matters for support. Part of the reason we think that is because people with our backgrounds, so the behavioral scientists, haven't really been in the picture too much. So looking at the sort of more psychological side of things, things are focused on, say, urban planning, engineers, and so on. So instead, we take some findings from environmental policies in general, so what matters for support there. What the literature shows there is that in general, when a change is proposed for an environmental policy, people tend to underestimate the benefits. So I talked at the start about all of the kind of positive benefits of implementing active travel infrastructure. So it's likely in this case that the public are likely to underestimate those if they believe that they will exist, but we don't have direct evidence, unfortunately. And also negatives are overestimated. So as I said, in the literature internationally, opposition from perspective of retail owners who suspect the negative effects on the back of active travel infrastructure being implemented, that tends to come up, and that seems to fit this idea that negative effects might be overestimated. Trust in implementing institution matters. So if you're presented with a plan, you need to trust that it's going to be implemented the way that you think that it will be implemented. And perceived fairness is vital. So that not only the sort of effects that the change is going to have, so is it going to benefit everyone? Is it just going to benefit, for example, the people who are already cycling, or is it going to have fair distributional effects on, for example, older groups who might be less likely to cycle? And fairness in the consultation process matters. One caveat that I want to flag with this is a sort of bias that can creep in. We call it hindsight bias, where essentially is you take the outcome of what happens and then you use that to color your judgment of how it came about. So if you dislike the outcome of a consultation process, maybe then you might be more likely to say that the consultation in itself was biased. So you want those kinds of judgments to come about before the outcome is known, so people agree on the consultation process, for example. And lastly, in the paper, we discuss other biases that we thought might be of relevance. So cognitive bias, in general, so they're called biases, which has a negative connotation, but they come from what we call heuristics, which are just mental shortcuts that we rely on day to day because it's simply too much for our brains to deal with, or dealing with all the information that's coming at us. So we, in general, make shortcuts, usually very handy, but sometimes lead us astray. So some of the biases that we thought might be relevant here include confirmation bias that people might be familiar with. So that just describes how, in essence, people are more likely to pay attention to and overweight information that aligns with a belief they already hold than one that goes against it. And that's closely related to what's called motivated reasoning. So you will kind of select evidence that helps you arrive at the conclusion you want to arrive at, rather than the conclusion that is sort of would be resulted from a more balanced assessment. A couple of other ones that we thought might be important are primacy effects. So the first piece of information you hear is overweighted in any subsequent judgment that you make. And this is important because even if that information is later debunked, it's very difficult to get rid of that having an influence on your judgment. So if you are first presented with misinformation on it, you can be told that that is misinformation, but it will still impact your judgments. So that first piece of information people hear is important, as are messenger effects, which is essentially just a description of who that message or where that message comes from, where that information comes from. Is it coming from an anonymous source out of the blue, or is it coming from someone that you trust? So this can work in multiple ways. So if you are, for example, getting maybe a slightly twisted version or some misinformed version about a planned scheme from someone you trust, then that's very difficult to then debunk. Or to correct that misbelief. So information should be coming from sort of trusted, credible sources as quickly as possible with schemes. And then a couple of final ones that are kind of interesting. So one of them is called collective illusion, or in the paper we call it pluralistic ignorance, which is not a very nice name, but collective illusion is where people can actually be quite poor at estimating the beliefs of the entire group. So for example, if I am exposed to vocal opposition to a scheme, for example, then I might start to think that that view is more representative of my group than it actually is. So I might think more people in the community are against this than I believe. And because we are very social creatures, then we might be less likely to speak up and voice your own opinion on it. So the evidence for this, it comes from a kind of wide range of papers. One, for example, is in Saudi Arabia on men's beliefs about women being allowed to work. So a lot of men reported that they thought women should be allowed to work, but they believed that other men thought that they shouldn't. So they weren't willing to voice that opinion. Correcting that misbelief actually then led to more women working when it was kind of followed up a few years later. So that was an objective measurement of more women working once the kind of misbelief that the men held was corrected. And lastly, one that we thought was important that we're doing more work on at the moment is status quo bias. And that's just a preference that we hold for things to stay the way they are, even if the alternative outcome is something that we would like. So the literature doesn't really explain why this is the case. We have some work that's ongoing, not yet peer reviewed, so I can't talk about it too much, but it does seem to be the case that people have a strong preference for keeping things the way they are, and that when a change is proposed, that people might then start to think about what might go wrong in it. So that can lead us then to prefer things staying the way they are. I have a summary slide, but I might have gone already over time on it, so I'll...
Oh, you're fine, actually, Shane.
Oh, good. Okay,
Plenty of time. Yeah, we can.
Okay, I'll go through
this is fascinating anyway. Sorry to interject, but yeah, no, keep going.
Yeah. Okay, no, all good. So yeah, that just is just a summary slide of a few icons and stuff that I put together to try to summarize everything. So basically, if we are trying to reach the end goal, and this is a kind of policy goal across from multiple domains, is to reduce the number of care journeys that are made. The reasons for this is not only to reduce our emissions, but there are also multiple co-benefits. So improved air quality and reduced noise pollution. Both of those have positive public health effects, which then have positive economic effects. So if we're reducing the burden on our public health system, there's going to be savings to be made there. So investing in something that would reduce the number of care journeys that are made seems to make sense. One way to bring this about is to have more people cycling and walking, engaging in active travel infrastructure. Again, I appreciate I'm preaching to the choir there with that one, which in itself comes with public health benefits. So we have healthier people, essentially, if they're swapping the car for the bike or for walking. The evidence suggests as well, I've dashed the line here rather than making it a solid one, because they're not always positive benefits to local retail and hospitality, but it seems to be the case that it's either going to have no difference, so revenue will stay the same, or increase. So that's the suggested international evidence, excluding the car-centric businesses, so petrol stations and so on, less likely to benefit, obviously, if there's fewer people in cars. What matters then for people active travel is the infrastructure that's in place. So implementing that infrastructure seems to make a difference, but there are important caveats with it. So there needs to be that high level of connectivity, so people are able to travel from A to B fully on that dedicated infrastructure. Things that matter are also perceived safety. So do people feel comfortable and safe when they're using that infrastructure? That can be improved using those wide segregated lanes, and importantly, having that color on there, which is quite a simple way to change it. Actual safety is obviously going to matter too. We have less evidence in the actual safety space, unfortunately, because of poor quality data that exists internationally. But where that data does exist, it all centers around intersections. So, for example, the advanced stop lines, priority lights for cyclists, traffic calming measures like speed limits, and so on. The evidence also suggests that these features are what matter for reducing the gender and age gap with cycling when infrastructure is implemented. So we see variation in the positive effects of infrastructure, which seem to be down to exactly how that infrastructure is designed. So just implementing it is unlikely to address those gaps if it's not designed in a way that actually matters for people's behavior. But of course, then to implement that infrastructure, you often need community support for it. And one of the kind of significant challenges here is that it seems to be the case that lots of the biases that at least we've identified would work against infrastructure being implemented. So misperceptions there, kind of driving overestimates of negative expectations and underestimates of the benefits. If negative information is heard first, and we know kind of multiple studies on kind of how news information and so on is shared, is that negative information tends to gain more traction than positive information. Who that message comes from matters. Status quo bias is something that is very prevalent and difficult to overcome. So we hadn't identified any studies that have managed to actually overcome status quo bias other than trials, which I could probably point to. Some of the kind of one of the most famous examples is the congestion charge that was run in London. So initially Londoners were very against the congestion charge being put in place, and then subsequently voted to retain it and increase it once it was put in place. So that's kind of one of the examples that's in there about status quo bias. Collective illusion then. So if those primacy effects and messenger effects lead to strong kind of vocal opposition to a scheme, that might lead then wider groups to think that opposition is more prevalent than it actually is, and then lead to fewer people wanting to engage on it. So that's everything for me. I've included the QR code and a few links there for the paper itself. So the first link is to the published version, but the working paper has more detail in it. So that has the evidence on kind of health and economic effects and so on. But yeah, happy to take any questions on it or comments. Indeed, we're planning a bit more work in the space, particularly on the status quo bias stuff. So any thoughts will be yeah, very much welcome.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much, Shane. It's amazing work and a huge amount compressed into your slides there, I think, and really, really interesting for the way things are going societally at the moment with the construction of the cycle lanes that we see going on, the NTA, the $1 million a day being invested in walking and cycling infrastructure all around the country, and then seeing the objections and the resistance in some places. So it's just fantastic to see insights into where those objections come from and what the reasoning is, and the whole concept of the status quo bias, which we can kind of you can feel yourself. It jives certainly with how my own experience of resisting change in my life. But so thanks.
I have a couple of questions here from the chat. Can I jump in with that? Is that okay? Yeah.
That's brilliant. Yeah, I see Donna has a question.
So, yeah, Donna has a question. So, sorry, Shane, thanks so much, by the way. That was fantastic. Donna's asked how are these related to actual travel times as opposed to the projected modeling? That was maybe 20 minutes ago. So it was when you were talking about how there was a small incremental increase in motorist travel times, but that wasn't taking into account the possibility modal shift. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then even as I mentioned, a lot of the papers will look at the sort of percentage change in travel times. In the working paper, we applied the suggested projection from the Australian modelling to the average commute time in Ireland from CSO data. And in that, I was very sort of basic rudimentary application of it, but average commute time by car in Ireland is 28.3 minutes, and if we take their increase, it would increase to 30 minutes. So 1 to 2 minute increase again is what you're kind of getting there. And then again, that assumes nobody has changed their behavior, that everyone is staying in the car.
So just to kind of to reiterate, so it's difficult to actually calculate the actual travel times after some infrastructure is gone because there's insufficient data presently, or it was just too much to take on. Yeah.
So certainly in Ireland, anyway, we don't have the data to estimate that. But anywhere that it has been done, there's either, I mean, there's lots of variation essentially in the literature, and that's because it's been measured in different ways. But yeah, it's something that is not straightforward to measure because you need to look at the same people before and after the change has been made, and then take into account anyone who might be traveling differently as a result. So not the most straightforward thing to measure, but the evidence at least suggests that where there are negative effects, they're likely to be very, very, very small.
Cool, thanks very much. So the next question came in from Hugh, and he was asking, have you shown this presentation to any local authorities? If so, how was it received by the councillors?
Yeah, so we presented it a few times to Fingal County Council, so they were one of the funders of it, and it was very positively received there. Otherwise, since the paper just came out last week, so it was just the sort of media coverage. This is actually my first time presenting it outside of those circles, so
we're very honoured. Yeah,
I'd be very happy to present it further, and plan to present it to other sort of policymakers and so on. So we have a few of those scheduled, but in general, it has been quite well received.
Yeah, thanks, Amelia. And then just the final question, and then I'll hand back to you, Will. So from Sean, is there any research about perception of the enforcement of close passing, enforcement of parked cars blocking infrastructure, etc.? I know obviously your research is to do with infrastructure, but is there any on enforcement?
Not that I'm aware of, but that's a very good question and something that I might look into. So the kind of application of behavioral science to policy problems more generally, enforcement is something that we do quite a lot of, monitoring the effects of it and so on. Some of the sort of wider literature suggests that in the literature it's called punishment, but essentially that would be the fine you receive for it. That what matters more is not the scale of the fine, but that the perceived likelihood, or how likely you think you are to be caught. That's a bigger deterrent than what the actual punishment is. So that's the sort of broader picture stuff on it. I'm not aware of anything that's specifically looked at this in the active travel space. But yeah, certainly I've written a note of it. I'll work it in somewhere if we can.
That would be fantastic, yeah. And then just to finish off, there's just been quite a lot of positive comments have come in the chat as well. So thanks a million. Will, I'll hand back to you. Yeah.
Thanks, Connor. That's great. Shane, I wondered just about the whole misinformation issue and myths. You know, we have the bicycle bingo. You might have heard of the various people won't cycle if it's raining. Very few people want to cycle, and so on and so forth. I know the NTA have sponsored your work here, and it's exactly what we need to counter that sort of misinformation. But do you think that's enough? Do you think there are other ways of getting that out there in like Irish cities, Galway, Limerick, Dublin?
Yeah, so it's a tricky one, I think, but part of exactly why we looked at this was to see what evidence is there, because what appeared to at least be happening in the debates is that there's very few people drawing on evidence for it, that people kind of come at it with their preconceptions about it, and that's where we see things like confirmation bias and motivated reasoning and all of those sorts of biases come in. Again, I need to draw on the sort of wider behavioral science literature to deal with that issue of misinformation, but what that literature suggests is that getting the accurate information out to people first is the only way to go, really. So once misinformation has gotten out there, it is very difficult to debunk. So the literature looks at instead what's called pre-bunking. So kind of trying to forecast what the bits of misinformation or disinformation are going to be, and then giving people the accurate information up front. because of those sorts of primacy effects that we see. It's just very difficult to overcome them. So it's part of that, and then apparently the messenger effects can be quite strong as well. So kind of even just kind of informal conversations with people that you trust about this thing, rather than kind of relying on anonymous sources or kind of faceless sources as information. I appreciate I'm not answering any of these very satisfactorily, but
That's great.
that's
Good info. I think Siobhan wants to come in there.
Yeah, I'll just come in with a question from Bob Quinn in the chat here, and it actually links exactly with what you're talking about there, Shane. So his question is, what impact or input should a behavioural analyst have at the point of designing and rolling out active travel infrastructure?
Well, I'm slightly biased here myself. I would say quite a lot. Yeah, so I think a few things that kind of cropped up that we thought were, for example, missing in the wider literature that looked at it were signals to people about why things have been put in place. So for example, if we take the raised cyclist crossing, oftentimes they're put in place and it's just kind of, people need to kind of assume why that's there. Whereas kind of signaling to people that this has been put in place because at this intersection, pedestrians and cyclists are given priority over motorists, then that helps to send a signal that that's the way, essentially it's a social norm for us now to operate that way. That we have a different hierarchy, that it's pedestrians, then cyclists, then motorists, that following that sort of hierarchy kind of assumption that it's the car comes first. So there's lots of those sorts of considerations that I think, well, at least we identified as not having been considered in the space, and that maybe if you have the behavioral science coming in with the urban planners and so on, that we might get a bit more of that. So the idea for the when Fingal County Council initially approached us was to come at it from that perspective, so to have behavioral scientists working with the engineers and so on, and having a kind of multidisciplinary application of it.
Great, thanks, Shane. So I have a few more questions. Sorry, Will, did you want to come in there? Sorry.
Yeah, I just thanks a million, Shane. I was just going to say maybe if we could go till 8:30, if that's okay with you, Shane.
Yeah, that's fine.
I was going to point out those couple of questions, Connor. Sorry, yeah.
Oh yeah, cool. Yeah. So I've 3 questions here from the panelists again, and I'm actually just going to jump ahead. I'll come back to one of the questions, is just to get a couple of different voices. Ellen just asked, is there any evidence that opposition to active travel infrastructure decreases as the level of infrastructure increases? Which is actually quite a cool question.
That's very cool question. Another one that I'll be writing down to look into.
So you'll be leaving with loads of homework.
Yeah. So I probably should have done this before we've published the report. So not that I'm aware of, but there is some evidence suggesting that, so related to that status quo bias that I pointed out, that once changes are implemented, people kind of start to see the benefits of them, and then appreciate that maybe concerns they had about negatives haven't come to fruition, and then people start to sort of favor them more. So in general, some of the evidence that has looked at say public opposition to infrastructure being implemented, and they do it the kind of before and after, that you see kind of weakening opposition afterwards. Now that's obviously a tricky policy challenge, because you can't necessarily say, oh, we're just going to put this on anyway because you're going to like it. We operate in a democracy where that's not necessarily going to be feasible, but it does suggest that maybe, for example, more trials would be helpful, so kind of helping people to see, okay, this is the actual change that's going to be in place, but obviously it depends on how those trials themselves are implemented. But yeah, good question, and one that I'll look up.
Cool, thanks, Shane. Then just next, where am I gone? Mary asks, she goes, thanks for a great presentation. I'm an urban planner, transport planner, and I'm struck that you identified connectivity as an important ingredient for an impactful active scheme, but it's also one of the elements that can be vociferously opposed by local communities when new permeability connections are proposed. Have you encountered any literature that suggests how to approach proposing new permeability connections? Sorry, that was quite long, but it was actually quite well written, so I thought I wasn't going to try and paraphrase it.
Yeah, no, I get it. So we do have some work ongoing at the moment. Again, so it's not peer reviewed, and the results won't be out now for another few weeks. But it looks at that not necessarily with permeability, but trying to see, okay, if status quo bias is in itself a problem, and we have a working paper up that suggests that it is part of the issue, that people just dislike change even if they would otherwise like the outcome that's in place, and trying to test ways to not try to sort of swing the dial, but more so to try to encourage a more balanced evaluation, so that we're kind of trying to get rid of these biases and have that balanced evaluations. We don't necessarily want to kind of bias people in another direction. So unfortunately, my answer to that is I'm not aware of any kind of proven ways to communicate to try to rebalance things, but it is stuff that we are working on at the moment. So again, another non-satisfying answer, but hopefully we can provide some evidence in that space in the next few months.
Right, thanks, Shane. So Donna has actually asked 2 questions, and I'm just going to read them out as they are. I think they're related, but they came in at different times. So Donna was asking, on status quo, is that more likely in times of uncontrollable change, such as wars, climate change, etc., that people want comfort of same? Yeah, and she goes, thanks. And I'm just going to read out her follow on, and I haven't had time to process it yet, so hopefully you can do better. Maybe to say that the reason why raised crossings and prioritizing pedestrian and cycling supports the rule of the roads that has always been there to favor the status quo. I think I've read that out wrong. I don't know if you can see it in the chat yourself.
Yeah, I might have a look.
Answer that.
Yeah, but I'll go with the first question, which again, that's a really interesting question. I'm not aware of anyone who has kind of looked at status quo between like sort of different periods of time. But what we have done in one study, so there's a working paper available on the ESRI website that looks at our first kind of investigation into status quo bias, and we did include in it a measure of people's own individual sort of aversion to uncertainty. And so how much they dislike uncertainty, because we thought maybe if status quo bias is a problem, it's driven by a dislike of uncertainty. And we actually saw that it didn't matter. So we see that same sort of status quo bias effect regardless of your level of uncertainty aversion. Now we did, maybe I shouldn't say this because I'm not 100% sure. I think we did see a higher level of dislike of active travel infrastructure when someone has had higher levels of uncertainty aversion, but it didn't relate directly to that status quo bias effect. So our best guess at the moment, so again, this is from a working paper. I have the caveat of not peer reviewed as a scientist and so on, but our best guess for what might be happening in that is that there's a theory in psychology called query theory, which essentially suggests that when you are evaluating something, you ask yourself a series of questions, and the questions you ask depend on, actually, I'm going to start this with an example. The studies that have been done to show this. In the example, students come in, it's usually students in a university hall, and half of them at random are given a mug, and they're asked, how much would you be willing to sell your new mug for? The other group are given the opportunity to buy the same mug. Okay, and again, it's just selected completely at random. The people who are asked how much they would sell it for give much higher valuations of the mug than the people who are willing to buy it. So the people who have it, I wouldn't sell this for anything less than €7. So that mug is worth €7 to them. The other group who are asked how much would you pay for it, they say €4. I wouldn't pay anything more than €4. So people are evaluating differently, even though it's just assigned at random whether they have it or whether they don't. And what seems to happen is that when you have it, so when you are the seller, when you try to evaluate it, you think about the positives of the mug first. So it's a nice souvenir. I like drinking tea, like that kind of thing. You'll ask yourself the positives. Whereas when you're a buyer, you're more likely to ask yourself the negatives. So why do I not want this thing? And because our essentially what we call working memory capacity, so our ability to think about too many things, that's limited. So we can only ask yourself a limited number of questions. So the first few questions you ask yourself drive your evaluation of it. And we think that might also play a role then in status quo bias. That when something already exists, you maybe are more balanced, so you kind of think about the positives and maybe some of the negatives. But when something is then proposed as a change, you start to think about the negatives first. So you think, oh, what might go wrong here? So at the moment, that's our kind of best guess, that it's less to do with general uncertainty, but instead to do with a kind of inbuilt tendency we have against the law of unintended consequences. That's probably the best way I could put it. Unfortunately, so it's really, really early work that we're doing. So we suspect this is the case. We have kind of replicated in a few studies, but finding ways to overcome it is another challenge.
Yeah, no, thanks a million. That's fascinating, but it kind of all goes to explain kind of a level of inertia that needs to be overcome for any change to be seen through successfully. Sorry, Siobhan, do you want to? So I know there's a couple of other questions, but Siobhan, do you want to hop in there? Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to come in here with Damien's question that was posted in the Q&A. I'm just conscious we're nearly at the end of the time. It's a good question on the phenomenon of confirmation bias. Is there anything we can do broadly, i.e. societally, to reduce how much confirmation bias happens? Do more educated societies practice less confirmation bias in their day-to-day discourses than less educated societies? Do we all simply need to think more critically?
Yeah, just full of easy questions tonight. No, that's
a very curious
another,
audience. Yeah.
No, another really good one. So on the confirmation bias, it's quite interesting. A lot of the work is done in the US, which actually suggests that people with higher levels of education might be better at confirmation bias and that they exhibit more of it. So that they are better able to engage in motivated reasoning. So some of the examples look at, say, for example, Republicans who are against gun laws, that those who are better educated are actually better at motivating themselves to kind of interpret evidence in a way that supports their pre-existing belief. So it seems that education is not going to be the solution there to it. Instead, some of the kind of best trials that have been done on it, mostly in the kind of online information space, is to essentially include disclaimers or kind of prompts for people to consider the veracity of something before they click into it. So you would have seen old Twitter, so when Twitter was Twitter, had been implementing some trials where warnings on it being like, oh, not to share this before you kind of read it, or to think about this before you share it, and so on. So prompting that sort of reflection when people are engaging with information is at the moment the best way to overcome it. So it's less of a sort of broad scale education issue, but prompting people to actually reflect on it. So it's less that some of the kind of suggestions about why it comes about is that people are kind of lazy when it comes to confirmation bias, and they'll just share fake news and all that kind of thing. But instead it seems to be like, if you can just prompt people, so it's just that they're not thinking about it. But if you prompt people to reflect on it, and like, is this just confirmation bias? So asking yourselves those sorts of questions, that seems to be the best way to go about it.
Thanks a million. And there's another really good one here from Liam. Did you encounter issues with data availability and/or quality in the course of your research? If so, what more could local authorities be doing to collect data on the effect of active travel interventions?
So if I just speak about the data that's available from an Irish perspective, it's a very strong yes. So essentially the paper that we have published has very few trials related to Ireland in it. We just don't have the evaluations done here. Some of them that have been done are more in the sort of policy report space and not in that sort of peer-reviewed academic publication space, which is what we had to rely on then for the full publication. So we have very little data in Ireland on it. If you're to ask me what I would kind of like to see at the type of data collected, is that those sort of robust trials that I mentioned. So measurements in the area that's proposed and a kind of matched area in terms of the demographics and the current active travel rates and so on. Measurements before anything is implemented in one of them, and then measured throughout and measured afterwards. So you kind of get that sort of randomized control element. I think that would be great to see.
Cool. I'm going to be really cheeky and ask a question of my own, if I can, and then I'm going to let Will finish up. I was just really taken by the question going back about the modeling and how it didn't kind of take into effect kind of the wider picture about taking into effect like modal shift, or what Dave O'Connor would have talked about, traffic evaporation and stuff like that. And is there any cited evidence that some of the modeling can sometimes become self-prophesizing and actually can kind of get in the way of the public conversation? Thanks.
Yeah, no, another really good question. So I don't know how those modeling papers essentially have been used afterwards. So we were only able to just access them as they are. We don't know how they've kind of fed into the policy space, or even tested to see have they been accurate. That's actually one evaluation that I didn't see, that we didn't come across in it. One of the kind of reasons that we understand why those modeling papers haven't taken in the thing that you think is very, very obvious to include is that estimating the behavioral change component of it is very difficult in itself. So you need to not only model the traffic effects, but firstly model the behavior change effects, which depend on all of those things that I mentioned. So how the trial is implemented and so on, or how the infrastructure is implemented, to then factor that into your modeling of the traffic. Now, just because something is very difficult to do and complicated doesn't mean that you do the simple version that's wrong. So that's, yeah, just a sort of wider kind of commentary on some of the papers that we came across in it.
I really appreciate that, Shane. Thanks a million. Will, yeah, thanks.
Thanks a million, Shane. Yeah. Siobhan, you were saying Bob Quinn has a question there. A criticism that we get in NACE. Sorry, we'll wrap up. I hope it's okay if we go on for just another couple of minutes. Just one last question. Was that the one you were looking at there, Siobhan? Thanks, Bob. Criticism we get in NACE is the active travel schemes that are in the town don't get used. We've essentially bits of bike lanes that are unconnected and as a result underutilized. When we get to the point of critical mass on an active travel front, much of the resistance will abate, I believe. What do you think of that, Shane?
Yeah, so I guess some of it feeds into some of the points it's making there. So that like disconnected lanes are what suggested that matters for how much people are going to use it, particularly groups that are less likely to cycle, ones that may be less comfortable going on joining the mainstream traffic. But another point on the criticism of how much the lanes are being used at the moment, for example, if that's based on some data that's been collected, that would be interesting to see. But otherwise, I would suspect that issues like confirmation bias and motivated reasoning could be creeping in there as well. If, for example, someone already opposes lanes being implemented, every time they see it not being used, that's going to stick out. Every time they see a cyclist on it, that's not. And then you have other biases that can kind of creep in, and you think, okay, nobody is ever using these because I'm just going to discount any time that I see someone actually using it. Now, that's again speculation on my part. We'd need to see the data on it, but my suspicion is that it might not be.
Yeah, amazing how strong those biases are. Look, thanks a million, Shane, and for